The linen closet on the second floor had a particular smell in the early morning, clean and slightly cool, the way a room smells when no one has entered it yet to claim the air. Samuel Walsh had learned this over 3 months of early risings, the way she had learned most things about the house. Quietly and without announcing what she knew. She was already downstairs before 5, moving through the kitchen with the unhurried efficiency of someone who understood that a household's ease was built in the dark hours no one witnessed. The copper pots along the north wall had been rehung after last Tuesday's dinner party, and she had rehung them slightly lower so Mrs. Perkins could reach the largest without the step stool. She did not mention this to Mrs. Perkins. She moved the step stool back to its corner and said nothing about it, and Mrs. Perkins ran her hand along the pot's rim the next morning with the expression of a woman who notices but does not need to speak. The stack of linen she was folding now was for the East guest room, which Diane Marsh used for visiting friends. Samuel worked her way through the pile the way she had worked her way through most things in the 7 years she had been doing this work. Methodically, from one end to the other, handling the difficult pieces first and leaving the simple ones for when her hands were warm and moving well. The fitted sheet was the difficult piece. She had long ago stopped fighting its corners and started simply knowing where they were. She was not yet 34. She looked younger when she was not tired, and she was often tired, and she had learned not to speak about that either. Downstairs a door opened. She heard it plainly because the house was quiet enough for the smallest things to be heard. A single door, the one at the rear of the east wing that led from the gravel track to the utility corridor, opening and closing with a deliberate latch, the sound of someone who did not want to wake anyone. She was the only person awake to hear it. She folded the last sheet, placed it on the stack, and went down to start the coffee. The Marsh estate sat at the end of a private road outside the village of Hadley Cross, a house that had been large once and was still large now, though it wore the weight differently than it once had. Diane Marsh had lived in it for 11 years, ever since her daughter Margaret had married and brought her here to live. Margaret had died the previous spring, leaving behind a husband who had, in Samuel's understanding, simply removed himself from the estate and from public view, and a mother-in-law who had not removed herself at all. The agency had placed Samuel through a referral she had not expected. A phone call on a grey Tuesday morning, 7 days after she had finished her previous placement with a family in Bristol, and a woman's voice on the other end reading her the position's particulars. Live-in housekeeping, 1 primary resident, additional staff consisting of a cook and a groundskeeper, and, she was told, a maintenance figure who had recently taken up residence in the estate's east wing. The position was listed under a name Samuel did not recognise, a Mr. Thomas Ellis, acting as household administrator. She had not met him before arriving. She had not thought about him much in the first week. What she thought about in the first week was the kitchen, which was beautiful and deeply inconvenient, its organisation reflecting decisions made by someone who did not cook. She spent 3 days quietly relocating things. She moved the colander 4 inches to the left, so it sat below the hook where it was meant to hang. She found the good knives wrapped in newspaper inside a drawer, as though someone had been preparing for a move that had not happened, and she unwrapped them one by one and honed them, and returned them to the magnetic strip where the marks in the paint showed they had always lived. Mrs. Perkins had watched all of this without comment, then one morning set a cup of tea on the counter beside Samuel and said, "The last one put the colander in the pantry. I never understood it." "Neither did I," Samuel said. That had been the beginning of their arrangement. It was during that first week that she met the man the agency had called the maintenance figure. She came around the corner of the East Wing's ground floor corridor with a basket of cleaning supplies and found him on his knees beside the skirting board, assessing something with a flashlight. He was wearing a grey canvas work shirt and trousers with a paint mark on the left knee. He looked up when she stopped walking, and she noted that he did not have the startled look of a man caught doing something questionable. He looked at her the way a person looks at another person they have been expecting. "Sorry," he said. "The plaster's been drawing moisture. I wanted to get to it before the cold sets." "The east-facing rooms always run damp," she said. "The garden drains toward the house on that side." A pause, brief and easy. "I'm Elliot," he said. "I've been told I'm here under the name Ellis. The paperwork." "I know about the paperwork," she said. "I'm Samuel." He nodded. She went past him with the basket and did not ask any further questions because his reasons for the name were his, and she did not make it her business to collect reasons. She learned him the way she learned the house, through accumulated small evidence. He woke earlier sometimes than even she did. He worked with the kind of care that suggested someone for whom things done correctly mattered more than things done quickly. He was not chatty. He did not hover. He left the kitchen exactly as he found it, which Samuel appreciated because Mrs. Perkins was particular about the kitchen and had once, with the prior maintenance man, conducted a campaign of silent relocation warfare that had lasted 6 weeks. Elliot disturbed nothing. He set down his cup where he found it, replaced a chair at the precise angle he had taken it from, and once, when she came downstairs earlier than usual, she found him reading at the kitchen table with the lamp set to its lowest setting, so as not to wake anyone before the morning required it. Diane Marsh first spoke to Samuel directly on the 3rd day. She summoned her to the sitting room just after 9 and told her, without looking up from the letter she was writing, that the east guest room's window dressings needed pressing before Friday. Samuel said she would see to it. Diane told her also that the cleaning staff from the village came Thursdays, and she was not to interfere with their routine. Samuel said she understood. Diane looked up then, not at Samuel's face, but at a point approximately 8 inches to the left of it, and said, "You're the 3rd housekeeper this year. I mention it only so you understand the position." Samuel looked at the 8 inches of air Diane had addressed and said, "I understand. Was there anything else?" Diane returned to her letter. Samuel left. She told Clara about it that evening from the kitchen phone. Her sister's voice came through with the particular warmth it always had, when Samuel had been mildly insulted and was pretending not to care. "3rd this year," Clara said. "She told you that like it was a warning." "It was a warning," Samuel said. "But it's also just information. I don't leave positions because of warnings." "You left the last one," Clara said. "The last one had 3 cats and a mold problem and no hot water pressure," Samuel said. "That wasn't a warning. That was a health situation." Clara laughed, and Samuel stayed on the phone long enough to feel like herself again, and then she washed the cup she had been drinking from and placed it back on the shelf and went to press the east guest room's window dressings. 3 weeks passed. Diane entertained twice, and both times Samuel managed the household coordination with the efficiency she had been building toward, making sure the flowers were arranged without being asked and the candles on the dining table replaced before they became unsightly and the silver brought out and returned without incident. She noted that Diane never thanked her for any of it and never found fault with any of it, which she took as a form of approval she had learned to recognize in houses like this one, where silence from the person at the top was as close to praise as the work would receive. Mr. Ellis remained in the east wing. She saw him most mornings in the kitchen, arriving shortly after she had the coffee started, taking the cup she had already poured because it was simply the one that was there, not because she had poured it for him. She knew that was what she told herself. She also knew that she had, on 2 separate occasions, poured it before she heard his door, which suggested she was keeping track of his movements with more attention than her work required. She did not examine this closely. The morning of the rain, she was crossing the gravel between the east wing's outer wall and the garden shed when she noticed his workbench through the gap of the utility room door. He had gone into the village that morning, she knew, because she had been in the corridor when he'd mentioned it to the groundskeeper. The bench was covered with tools, laid out in the precise patient order of someone who worked with them regularly, a hand plane and 2 chisels at the near end, the smaller pieces aligned behind. The sky was the colour it gets before rain comes quickly, a particular flat grey without depth, and the utility room had a gap where the roofline's gutter had shifted and let water in when the rain ran hard. She found a dry cloth on the shelf inside the door and spread it across the bench. She tucked it around the edges of the hand plane and the 2 chisels where the rust would start first, smoothing the cloth down along the wood handles with a practical, even motion. She did not think of it as a gesture. She thought of it as something that needed doing, the same way the colander had needed moving and the knives had needed unwrapping, because things should be where they belong and in the condition that lets them work. She had been back in the kitchen for 20 minutes when the rain came, hard and sideways, running sheets against the garden-facing windows. She did not check whether the cloth had held. She was already making a list of what needed doing before Diane's Friday luncheon. The Friday luncheon was where the public humiliation began in earnest. Diane had invited 4 women she referred to collectively as her committee, a phrase that carried significant social freight that Samuel was not supposed to notice. The luncheon was simple food made to look complicated, and Samuel had prepared it the way she prepared everything, with attention and without flourish. The women arrived at noon. By past they were at the table, and Diane was performing for them with the ease of someone who had been doing it for decades. Samuel was passing through the dining room with the soup course when Diane paused mid-sentence and said, clearly and for the room's benefit, "Samuel, the ladle marks on the tureen. I've mentioned this." There were no ladle marks on the tureen. Samuel had checked it herself. She set the course down at the table's end and said, "I'll take another look at it," and left the room without saying anything else, because there was nothing else to say. She heard one of the committee women say something in a low voice that contained the word agency. And she heard Diane's reply, which was smooth and final, and not quite loud enough for a person in the hall to catch clearly. The tone of it was what mattered. The tone was the sound of a person being classified. She went back to the kitchen where Mrs. Perkins was waiting with the particular stillness she deployed when she had witnessed something and chosen not to act on it yet. "The tureen is fine," Samuel said. "I know," Mrs. Perkins said. "I polished it this morning." They did not discuss it further, and the luncheon ran without incident. And afterward, Samuel washed the tureen herself and set it back in the cabinet, and the ladle marks continued not to exist. The weeks that followed ran with the particular rhythm she had learned to navigate, the long intervals of good work, broken by the precise application of small public corrections designed less to correct than to establish. A Tuesday when Samuel was told, at a household meeting, attended by herself and Mrs. Perkins and the groundskeeper, that her handling of the guest room inventory was inconsistent with the standard the house had always maintained, with no specifics offered. A Thursday when Diane instructed her, in front of the village cleaning staff, to refold the towels in the upstairs bathroom because the folds were not aligned. Samuel refolded them. The folds had been aligned. She called Clara on Thursdays. She did not always mention the corrections because mentioning them wore them in, gave them a weight they did not deserve to carry. In the East Wing, Elliot continued his work. He had moved through the house's structural complaints with the same patient attention she had given its domestic ones, and she noticed, without wanting to, that his approach was not the approach of a man doing a job, but of a man doing his own thing in his own place. He took time over the decisions. He checked his work. He did not cut into a wall until he had traced where the damage ended, which she respected, because she did not like waste, and she did not like unnecessary holes in things. They spoke most mornings. The conversations were brief, contained to the coffee and to whatever was in front of them that day. Once he asked her how long she'd been doing this work, and she said 7 years. And he said, "You must have seen a lot of houses." And she said, "Enough to know which ones know their houses and which ones are trying to be something else." And he had looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully read before he said, "This one's been trying for a while." She had not asked him what he meant. She filed it. The proximity of the kitchen mornings had begun to have a particular quality she had noticed, and was carefully not naming. His presence was not intrusive. He did not fill the room's silence with unnecessary sound. She was aware of him with a specific and low-level attention that reminded her of the way she was aware of weather, something that did not demand acknowledgement but informed the quality of everything she did. The mornings had started to feel different in the way that certain rooms feel different when the furniture is placed correctly, not better exactly, but right in a way that is difficult to reverse once you have noticed it. She thought about this on a Sunday morning in early November, watching the rain again at the window and finding that she had been looking at the doorway for a while before she knew she was doing it. He came in 4 minutes later. She turned back to the stove. Diane escalated in the 2nd month. The pattern was established enough now that Samuel recognized its components: a gathering occasion, a small audience, a correction that sounded specific but referred to nothing verifiable. What changed in the 2nd month was the audience. Diane had begun inviting more people to the house, and the corrections began occurring in rooms with more witnesses, as though the project required an expanding stage. The November household meeting was the most deliberate of these. Diane called the full staff into the sitting room, which was already unusual, and worked through a list of the household's management concerns in a tone that was measured and instructional, and landed on Samuel specifically with the precision of something that had been prepared: the linen inventory, the order of priority for guest room preparation, the management of the kitchen's dry stores, which apparently had not met the standard maintained by the household's previous permanent housekeeper. The word permanent was not accidental. Samuel stood near the doorway and listened and said, "Noted," at the correct intervals, and did not look at Mrs. Perkins, who was beside her. She could feel Mrs. Perkins beside her the way you feel the presence of a person who is very still and very deliberate about it, the weight of a witness who has made her decision about what she is witnessing. After, in the kitchen, Mrs. Perkins set the kettle on and said only, "She's done this before." It was not offered as comfort. It was offered as information, and Samuel received it as such. "Did the others stay?" Samuel asked. "The one before you lasted 10 weeks, Mrs. Perkins said. The one before her lasted 4. "I've been here 12, Samuel said. "Yes," Mrs. Perkins said. The kettle came to a boil. Mrs. Perkins poured. They drank their tea without saying anything further, and the silence was the companionable kind, the kind that does not require filling. The agency call came on a Thursday in late November. Samuel was in the east corridor with a mop and a bucket, attending to a seam in the stone floor where the damp had gotten back in, when she heard the sitting room door, which was opposite the stairwell on the ground floor, pulled partially closed, but not latched. Diane's voice carried through it clearly. She was on the telephone. Samuel did not slow down. She moved the mop, heard the shape of the conversation before the words, and then stopped, because the words reached her distinctly through the gap, and she could not unhear them once they arrived. "She's competent enough," Diane said. "The work is fine, but I want you to begin looking again. She's not the right fit for the household long term. The fit here is about more than the work. A pause. You know what I mean. The family entertains. There are standards of presentation that matter. She doesn't carry the right background for the people we have in. Another pause. She's a temporary convenience. That's all she's been from the beginning. The last sentence was the one that landed. It landed the way a flat hand lands on a table. Not loud, but impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was. Samuel moved the mop again. She continued down the corridor to the end, finished the floor, returned the mop to the utility room, and went upstairs to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and called Clara. Clara answered on the second ring, and Samuel told her the sentence precisely, without preamble, because it was the kind of sentence that required witnesses. Clara was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You're going to leave." "I don't know yet," Samuel said. "Sam," Clara said, "I don't know yet," she said again. She did not sleep much that night. She lay in the dark of the room she had made orderly and comfortable across 3 months. The particular smell of the house around her, and she thought about the 7 years of this work and what she had built from it. And she thought about the account book she had been keeping for the house since her first week, recording expenditures and schedules and staff hours and inventory in the small leather notebook she carried in her apron's left pocket. She thought about the colander and the knives and the copper pots, and she thought about Diane's voice through the sitting room door, and she thought about what it meant to do a thing well for people who had already decided it did not matter. By 3 in the morning, she had decided. She rose and went to the desk and began to work. She worked until 6. What she produced was not just the notebook's contents transferred to a proper ledger, but a complete household account. 7 years of experience compressed into a document that traced every supply source, every seasonal schedule, every maintenance pattern she had identified across 3 months, the linen inventory by room and grade, the kitchen stores by supplier and price, the staff schedules and their dependencies. The guest room preparation order Diane had criticized at the meeting was there, annotated with the reasoning behind each decision so that anyone who came after would not have to work it out again from nothing. She was precise where precision served the next person. She was generous where generosity cost her nothing but time. She did not write her name on the cover. She was going to leave it on Diane's desk before she called the agency herself and told them she was done. She was going to leave the house with the same quiet she had brought to every morning in it, without a scene and without a speech, because that was who she was regardless of the audience. She was downstairs in the kitchen, the ledger under her arm when Elliot came in from the east wing. She had not heard him coming. The kitchen was lit with the early grey of 6:30, and she was standing at the counter with her coat over her arm and the ledger in her hands, and she looked like what she was, which was someone leaving. He stopped in the doorway. "You're going," he said. "I'm planning to leave the ledger on her desk," Samuel said. "Then I'm going to call the agency." He did not move from the doorway. He did not ask her to stay, did not reach for an argument or a reason she was obliged to accept. He looked at the ledger under her arm, and then at her face, and something in his expression shifted in a way she registered but could not interpret. Then he came into the kitchen and pulled out the chair at the table and sat down. Not in the casual way he sat down each morning, but with a deliberateness that said he had something to say, and he was deciding how to say it. "Stay through the weekend," he said. "Why?" she asked. "There's a dinner on Saturday. Diane's invited a group. I need you to stay through Saturday." She looked at him across the kitchen and thought about the sentence she had heard through the sitting room door, and thought about the 7 years and the account book and the copper pots and the knives she had unwrapped from their newspaper, and returned to where they had always lived. She thought about a cloth spread over a workbench in the minutes before a hard rain. "One more day isn't a reason," she said. "No," he said. "It's a request." She put her coat over the back of the other chair and went to start the coffee. She kept the ledger. She worked through Friday and Saturday with the same attention she brought to everything. The dinner was for 6 of Diane's acquaintances, a more formal affair than the luncheons, and it required the dining room set formally, the good silver out, the wine decanted correctly, the table dressed to the particular standard that Diane considered self-evident and never needed to specify, because it was Samuel's job to already know. Samuel managed all of it. She pressed the good napkins herself. She checked the silver twice. She arranged the flowers in the low style that suited the dining table, without crowding the conversation across it. Elliot stayed in the east wing through the morning and afternoon. She did not see him. The guests arrived at 7. Samuel served and managed with her usual quiet efficiency, moving between the kitchen and the dining room in the rhythm she had built across 3 months. Mrs. Perkins was in the kitchen, coordinating the courses with the calm authority of a woman who has done this a great many times and sees no occasion for urgency. The conversation from the dining room came through in the register of well-practiced social performance, the particular cadence of people who have known each other long enough to be comfortable performing for one another. At the second course, Elliot appeared in the doorway of the dining room. He had changed out of the canvas workshirt. He was wearing a dark jacket Samuel had not seen before, and he stood in the doorway with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, more conscious, like a person who has decided the time has come to be somewhere and is taking the space that belongs to him. Diane looked up. The conversation at the table paused, the way conversation pauses when something has entered a room that wasn't accounted for. "I'd forgotten you were still here," Diane said, and the tone was the social ranking tone Samuel had learned to recognize, smooth and just slightly amused, the tone of a person who treats other people's presence as subject to their own permission. "I've been here a while," Elliot said. He came to the table and took the empty chair at the far end, which put him directly in the room's sightline. Diane's expression was performing composure while calculating something behind it. 2 of her guests looked at him with the mild curiosity of people who recognize that a scene has shifted but do not yet know how. Mrs. Perkins came through the kitchen door with the next course. She set the dish down at the table's center, and as she straightened, she looked at Elliot with the plain, clear expression of a woman who has been waiting for something for a long time and has watched it finally arrive. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "I've kept yours warm." The room changed. It changed the way a room changes when the fact that had been absent from it suddenly takes up all the space. It was not loud. There was no dramatic shift in the light or the temperature. A chair creaked slightly as one of the guests turned. Diane's hand, which had been resting on the stem of her wineglass, did not move. Samuel, standing in the doorway between the kitchen corridor and the dining room with the water pitcher in both hands, understood what she was hearing in the way you understand something you have half known for weeks. Marsh, not Ellis. Marsh. The estate's name, the family's name, Margaret's name. The name on the legal documents she had filed in the household records drawer under Estate Administration, pending. One of Diane's guests, a woman with silver hair seated near the middle of the table, looked at Elliot and said carefully, "I'm sorry, I wasn't aware that you were—" "I've been staying in the East Wing," Elliot said, attending to some of the house's structural needs. His voice was exactly the voice she had heard every morning in the kitchen for 3 months. Nothing performed in it. Nothing changed. The silver-haired woman looked at Diane. Diane was looking at her wineglass. The composure was still on her face, but it had the quality of something that was being held in place, rather than sitting naturally. She said, "Elliot has always been welcome in the house." And the sentence was correct in its words and completely wrong in its cadence. the cadence of someone reading from a script that no longer fits the room. "I appreciate that," he said. He said nothing else. He did not look at Diane with triumph. He looked at the table with the patience of a man who has waited for something and is content to let it settle at its own pace. The dinner continued. The surface of it continued. But the room's architecture had rearranged itself around the new fact, and everyone at the table knew it and was processing it in their own way. Diane's contributions to the conversation became shorter. The silences between them became longer. When the silver-haired woman asked Elliot a direct question about the estate's East Wing renovation, he answered in 3 sentences, and the table listened in the way it had been listening to Diane for the previous hour. The shift was not announced. It did not need to be. Samuel refilled water glasses and did not look at Diane directly. She looked at Mrs. Perkins, who had returned to the kitchen doorway and was standing with both hands folded, and the expression she wore when she considered a thing to be satisfactorily resolved. After the guests had gone, the house settled into the particular silence of a post-dinner evening, plates cleared and silver soaking and the dining room dim. The candles had burned low and were not replaced, because there was no one left who needed impressing. Samuel was at the kitchen sink when Diane came in, not through the dining room door, but through the corridor, which was unusual, the kind of path someone takes when they are looking for a room that will not have an audience. She stood at the kitchen's edge and looked at Samuel's back and said, "The dinner was well managed." Samuel turned off the tap. She turned around. "Thank you," she said. Diane looked at the point somewhere beside Samuel's face, the way she always had, and this time it seemed less like a choice and more like the only thing she had left. "The agency call," she said. "I will be in touch with them to say that the position is ongoing, that there's no need for a change." Samuel looked at her. "That's yours to manage," she said. "I'll be speaking to the agency myself." Diane left the kitchen the way she had entered. Through the corridor, her footsteps measured and deliberate, the sound of someone conducting a retreat with the dignity they have remaining. Samuel stood at the sink for a moment, looking at her own hands, and then she finished washing the last pot and set it on the drying rack and dried her hands on the cloth she kept by the tap. The cloth was worn soft at its center and still firm at its edges, the way things get when they have been used properly for a long time. Perkins came in from the dining room side and said only, "There's tea on." And Samuel sat down at the kitchen table and found the ledger there where she had left it Saturday morning, still closed, its pages still holding all the knowledge she had been about to carry out of the house. She left it there. Elliot came into the kitchen a little while later. Mrs. Perkins took her tea and, with the deliberate grace of a woman who has done this sort of thing before, found a reason to be somewhere else. He pulled out the chair across from Samuel and sat down. He looked at the ledger and then at her. The kitchen was warm, and the house around them was quiet in the way it is quiet after something has been resolved. "I should have told you before tonight," he said. "Why didn't you?" she asked. "I wanted to know what the house was, what she had made it into." He paused, choosing his words with the same care he brought to his work, not reaching for the convenient sentence, but waiting for the accurate one. "Margaret left it to me. Diane was meant to have use of it during her lifetime, but the estate's management decisions are mine. I needed to understand what I was inheriting." Another pause. "I also needed to know who was in it. What kind of people?" Samuel looked at him for a long moment. "You were watching," she said. "Yes," he said, "including me." "Especially you," he said, and there was nothing theatrical in it, nothing performed. It was the most honest sentence she had heard in 3 months of a house where very few sentences had been honest. She thought about the cloth over the workbench tools. She thought about the 2 cups already poured before his door opened. She thought about the ledger she had stayed one more day to not leave. "The cloth," she said. He understood immediately. His expression moved in the quiet way it moved. "I came back from the village that morning and everything was dry," he said. "It needed doing," she said. "It did," he said. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was dark, and the house held the two of them in the way a house holds people when it has finally arrived at the arrangement it was built for. Not loudly, simply. In the days that followed, Samuel learned the practical shape of what the revelation had changed. Elliot met with the estate's solicitors and began the formal process of assuming active management of the property. Diane remained in the house, as she was entitled to, but the architecture of authority had shifted in a way that required no announcement. She came to the kitchen less. She stopped holding household meetings. The corrections stopped coming, the way a particular kind of weather stops coming when the season that produces it has passed. Mrs. Perkins informed Samuel of all of this with the same straightforwardness she applied to everything, one morning over the tea they had been sharing since the beginning. She also informed her, with the tone of a woman releasing information she had been holding a long time, that Elliot had arrived at the estate in August with the specific intention of understanding who was running it and what it was costing, and that he had told the agency to send someone with 7 years of experience and a reputation for treating the work as work rather than as performance. "He asked for me specifically," Samuel said. "He asked for what you are," Mrs. Perkins said. "I don't know if that's the same thing." Samuel looked at the window. Outside, the garden was winter bare, the beds cut back and the gravel raked to the edge of the path. She thought about the agency call on the grey Tuesday, the name she hadn't recognized, the position whose particulars she had heard and accepted because the work was the work, regardless of the house. She thought about the way the 7 years had made her someone who folded the difficult sheet first and moved the colander 4 inches and unwrapped the good knives and returned them to where the marks in the paint showed they had always been. She thought, "It is a strange thing to have been known before you knew you were being seen." Clara arrived on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the dinner, in a rental car with an overnight bag and a container of the shortbread she made when she felt the occasion required it. She came through the front door and looked at the house the way Clara always looked at a place Samuel had been living in, with the particular inventory gaze of a younger sister who has spent years understanding a person through their rooms. "It's a good house," Clara said. "It knows it's a house," Samuel said. Clara looked at her with the expression she had when something had been confirmed. They sat in the kitchen that afternoon, the 3 of them, Samuel and Clara, and Mrs. Perkins. And Mrs. Perkins made tea and brought out the shortbread from the container and set it on the board she used for baking. And they sat around the table, and the conversation ran easily and warm the way conversation runs when the room has settled into the right people. Clara asked about the house's history with the cheerful curiosity of someone who has been thoroughly briefed and wants the texture of the thing in addition to the facts. Miss Perkins provided the texture without being asked, in the measured, precise way she provided most things. Elliot came through the east wing door at 4:30, wearing the canvas work shirt again, and Samuel introduced him to Clara. And Clara shook his hand with the expression of a woman who has been briefed extensively and is confirming the briefing against the original. She held his hand a beat longer than a standard greeting required, the look of a younger sister conducting a rapid and thorough assessment. And then she smiled and said it was good to meet him. And she meant it, and he could tell she meant it, which Samuel noticed. After, Clara helped Samuel with the linen, folding the sheets in the upstairs closet with the particular competence of a woman who had learned to fold fitted sheets from watching her sister do it. And she said, without looking up from the corner she was aligning, "You're staying." "Yes," Samuel said. "For the house," Clara said. Samuel looked at the sheet in her hands. Among other reasons, she said. Clara nodded and said nothing else, which was the wisest thing to say, and they finished the linen in the comfortable quiet of people who have understood each other for a very long time. That evening, after Clara had gone to the guest room and Mrs. Perkins had gone home, and the house had found its nighttime register, Samuel came down to the kitchen one last time. She was not checking anything. There was nothing to check. The kitchen was in order, the pots re-hung at the height that suited Mrs. Perkins, the knives on the strip where the marks in the paint had always said they belonged, the colander where the hook had always waited for it. The last dish was dry on the rack. The cloth by the tap was folded in thirds and set beside the sink where it would be there in the morning. She stood in the threshold between the corridor and the kitchen, her hand resting on the doorframe for a moment. The same doorframe she had crossed every morning for 3 months, with a basket or a list or a cup in her hands, always with somewhere to be, always with something to attend to. She crossed it now the way a person steps into a room that has become theirs, without the permission of necessity, simply because it is where they are. The leather notebook sat on the counter beside the kettle. She picked it up and held it for a moment, its worn cover soft in her hands, the weight of it familiar in the way that a useful thing becomes familiar when you have carried it long enough. Then she set it back in the pocket of her apron, where it had lived for 7 years, because some things belong where they belong, and the knowing of that is its own kind of arriving.